Rain had fallen since dawn, a fine silver rain that softens Cedar Hollow Elementary and turns the red maples beyond the playground into blurred stains of autumn color. By 3 o'clock, the blacktop shone like polished stone. Water ticked from the gutters and ran beneath the chain-link fence. The children had been kept inside for recess, but that afternoon the school held its annual community day, and families crowded beneath canvas awnings near the gym. Paper cups of cider steamed in cold hands. Somewhere near the music room, a student practiced the same 4 trumpet notes again and again. Elias Mercer was carrying a box of extension cords across the covered walkway when the talking stopped. It thinned in ripples. One parent fell silent, then a teacher. A group of 5th graders beside the raffle table turned toward the wooded edge of the grounds. A bobcat stood in the rain. She was 40 yards away, where wet grass met cedar and fern. Her coat was darker than Elias remembered, soaked along the spine and patterned with shadowy spots. The notch in her left ear was still there. So was the pale mark above her right shoulder. For 16 months, Elias had wondered whether he would ever see her again. Now she lowered her head, studied the crowd, and began walking toward him. Elias set the box down carefully. His school keys tapped once against his belt, a small bright sound beneath the rain. The bobcat's ears turned forward. She remembered that sound. More than 100 people stood in the yard, yet she chose a line toward the janitor in his faded green work shirt and rain-darkened boots. She did not hurry. Her paws touched the grass almost without sound, and her short tail remained low, its black tip twitching whenever someone whispered. Principal Lenora Shaw raised one hand, asking everyone to stay still. Elias wanted to warn the children not to crowd her or mistake her approach for tameness, but his throat tightened. He lowered his shoulders and kept his hands open at his sides. A little boy near the awning clutched his mother's coat. "Is that Juniper?" His mother pressed a finger to her lips. The name seemed to pass through the silence anyway. Juniper crossed the painted line at the edge of the blacktop. Rain purled along her whiskers. She paused beside a puddle, looked at her reflection as though it had offended her, and stepped around it with the same suspicion she had once shown toward a yellow mop bucket. A few children hid nervous smiles. Elias noticed that habit, and something inside him loosened. She was still herself, not a memory shaped by loneliness. She was Juniper, watchful, particular, wild, and free to turn back whenever she chose. For anyone who had ever been changed by an animal, this was the kind of moment worth carrying gently. Those who wished could quietly like and subscribe, then share where they were listening from and the name of an animal that had once marked their life. The invitation passed as softly as the rain. Juniper came within 10 feet. Elias heard her breathing, light and controlled. He smelled wet cedar, cold pavement, and lemon cleaner clinging to his sleeves. Ordinary things had always been their language: a broom scraping tile, keys at his hip, a door opened slowly, a man who never stepped closer than she allowed. She stopped again. Her amber eyes moved over his face. Elias had aged during those 16 months. More silver showed in his beard. His left knee stiffened on damp mornings. He still rubbed his thumb over his key ring whenever he worried. He was rubbing it then. Juniper's ears flicked at the metallic whisper. Behind him, someone began crying quietly. Elias did not turn. He had imagined this meeting so many times that he had trained himself to stop. In some versions, she appeared at the tree line and vanished before he could be certain. Never had he imagined her crossing a crowded schoolyard. Hope, he had learned, could become another way of holding too tightly. So he did nothing. Juniper took the final steps. She did not rub against him like a house cat. She did not purr or ask to be touched. She remained a wild bobcat, whose muscles carried the memory of distance, weather, hunger, and survival. When she reached Elias, she angled her body rather than facing him. He could see a broken white whisker on the right side of her muzzle. Then she leaned. It was only her shoulder, only the lightest pressure against the outside of his rain-soaked trousers, placed exactly where her old injury had once made her flinch from every movement. Elias stopped breathing. The lean lasted perhaps 2 seconds, 3 at most. Around the yard, teachers bowed their heads. Parents wiped their faces. Children stood perfectly still, their expressions open with the solemn wonder adults often forgot how to feel. Elias did not touch her. That restraint cost him more than anyone there knew. His hand trembled once beside his thigh, then became still. He let Juniper decide the measure of the moment. He let her take what she had come for, the sound of his keys, the scent of lemon cleaner, and the quiet shape of a man who had once asked nothing from her. Juniper stepped away. She looked up at him, blinked slowly once, and turned toward the cedars. A yellow leaf had stuck near her hind paw. She shook it free with an irritated kick, and a soft laugh moved through the crowd. Elias smiled through the ache in his chest. Even then, she would not tolerate being decorated. Before leaving, Juniper glanced toward the wooded boundary. Her attention sharpened. Something beyond the ferns had caught her notice, something the others could not yet see. Elias followed her gaze, but rain concealed the deeper shadows. When he looked down again, Juniper had moved several steps away. The warmth of her shoulder remained against his leg, impossible and faint, like sunlight remembered through winter glass. He understood that she had not returned to be kept. She had returned because she remembered. And for that quiet truth, the entire schoolyard seemed to hold its breath. Long before Juniper crossed the schoolyard in the rain, Elias Mercer had been known as the man who stayed after the bells. He arrived at Cedar Hollow Elementary each weekday at 6 in the morning, when the halls still smelled faintly of floor wax, pencil shavings, and yesterday's cafeteria rolls. He unlocked the side entrance, switched on the corridor lights one row at a time, and stood for a moment beneath the humming fixtures as if listening to the building wake. At 61, Elias moved with the careful economy of someone who had spent years lifting desks, replacing ceiling tiles, and carrying boxes no one else remembered ordering. His left knee complained on wet days. He kept 2 pairs of reading glasses in his shirt pocket because he was always misplacing one. A chipped blue mug waited beside the boiler room sink, and every morning he filled it with coffee strong enough to make the school secretary wrinkle her nose. Paint thinner, she called it. Elias called it breakfast. He lived 3 blocks from the school in a narrow apartment above what had once been Mercer Flowers. The gold lettering still clung to the front window, though half of the final S had peeled away. His wife, Ruth, had run the shop for 27 years. She had known which roses opened slowly, which lilies were too fragrant for hospital rooms, and which lonely customers needed conversation more than flowers. After she died, Elias had closed the shop. He had not been able to remove the sign. The apartment above it remained mostly as Ruth had left it. Her yellow raincoat hung near the back door. A stack of gardening magazines rested beside the couch. In the kitchen, 3 small clay pots stood empty on the windowsill, because Elias had never learned what she used to put in them each spring. He told people the place was too quiet. The truth was that quiet had become the only thing he trusted. At school, silence felt different. It was temporary, full of evidence that voices would return. There were construction paper stars taped crookedly to doors, sneakers forgotten beneath benches, and tiny fingerprints on every pane of glass below shoulder height. Even before the first bus arrived, Elias could sense the coming noise sleeping inside the building. He liked being there for it. He knew which classroom radiator knocked twice before warming. He knew that the library door swelled during rain and needed a gentle shoulder near the latch. He knew that Mrs. Alvarez in second grade hid emergency chocolate behind the dictionaries, and that Mr. Pike from music always left one chair standing alone after rehearsals. Elias fixed these small irregularities without announcing himself. He tightened loose desk legs. He returned lost mittens to classrooms. He kept spare granola bars in the boiler room for children who missed breakfast and claimed they were inventory samples whenever anyone noticed. The students knew him as Mr. Mercer, though the younger ones often called him Mr. Marker. He never corrected them sharply. Once a kindergartner asked whether he slept in the janitor's closet. "Only during math," Elias replied. For 2 weeks afterward, the child inspected the closet each afternoon, hoping to catch him. There had been no children in Elias and Ruth's marriage. They had tried for years, then stopped talking about trying. Ruth had carried the grief more openly at first, while Elias buried his inside work. Later they built a life around other people's children, nieces, neighbors, the school's holiday drives, and any student who wandered into the flower shop with a crumpled dollar for Mother's Day. Ruth had once told him that care did not become smaller just because it had nowhere obvious to go. After she was gone, Elias often wondered whether the love inside him had simply become another locked room. Cedar Hollow gave him keys. His ring held 23 of them, though only 18 still opened anything. The rest belonged to old cabinets, replaced padlocks, and doors removed during renovations. He refused to throw them away. Their familiar weight against his hip steadied him as he walked. Children could hear him coming before he rounded a corner, the soft metal rhythm accompanying the scrape of his broom. Every afternoon, after the buses pulled away, Elias made one final circuit of the grounds. He checked the gates, emptied the outdoor bins, and searched beneath the playground equipment for abandoned jackets. The wooded boundary behind the school received special attention. The forest began with cedar, sword fern, and blackberry cane, then climbed toward a low ridge of maple and pine. Deer sometimes appeared near the soccer field at dawn. Raccoons raided the dumpster despite the locking bar. Once, a barred owl watched Elias change a floodlight and remained so motionless that he apologized for disturbing it. Wildlife belonged to that edge, and Elias respected the line. He never left food outside. He reported damaged fencing and reminded students not to chase animals for photographs. When he found tracks in mud, he studied them without following. He had learned from Ruth that admiration did not require possession. Still, the woods drew him. Some evenings he stood near the maintenance shed after finishing his rounds, breathing the scent of wet bark and cedar needles. The school behind him glowed window by window. Ahead, the forest darkened without asking permission from clocks or schedules. On those evenings, Elias felt his loneliness most clearly. It was not sharp anymore. It had worn smooth with time, like a stone carried in a pocket. He could work around it, laugh around it, and sleep beside it. Yet certain sounds still opened the old ache. The rustle of florist paper, a kettle clicking off, rain tapping against the shop window below his apartment. He had become skilled at expecting little. That was why, on the February evening when he first heard a low rasp behind the equipment shed, he assumed it was a branch dragging against metal. He finished tying the trash bag. The sound came again. Not loud, not pleading. A warning from something that still had enough strength to be afraid. Elias straightened slowly. His keys settled against his hip. Beyond the shed, in the narrow darkness between the wall and the fence, 2 amber eyes watched him without blinking. For the first time in many months, the locked room inside him stirred. The space behind the maintenance shed was barely 3 feet wide. Corrugated metal stood on one side, the school's old perimeter fence on the other. Blackberry canes filled the gap, their thorns hooked into wire, dead leaves, and one frightened animal. Elias did not move closer. The amber eyes lowered, disappeared, then returned beneath a branch. A compact shape pressed against the shed wall. The bobcat's ears lay flat, and the short black-tipped tail struck the ground once. Not like a dog wagging, like a warning being underlined. "All right," Elias whispered. "I see you." The cat answered with a rough, breathy growl. Elias had heard raccoons hiss from dumpsters, but this sound carried a different weight. It came from a chest thinned by cold and exhaustion. It did not ask for help. It warned him not to forget what she was. His key ring clicked against his belt. The bobcat's head jerked toward the sound. One forepaw shifted, but the other remained close to her body. When she tried to turn, her right shoulder dipped sharply, and she stopped with her teeth bared. Elias saw no blood, only mud, burrs, and damp fur clumped along one side. A length of green plastic darden mesh had twisted around her hind leg and disappeared into the blackberry tangle. Each movement tightened it. The school had used that mesh around a pumpkin patch the previous autumn. Elias remembered rolling it behind the shed after the first frost, meaning to dispose of it later. He felt the blame arrive quietly. Most forgotten chores waited patiently, but sometimes neglect caught hold of a living creature and pulled tighter each time she struggled. Elias crouched near the corner of the shed, though not close enough to block the opening. His knee protested with a soft crack. The bobcat blinked at him. Mine does that too. Her ears lifted half an inch, as if his joint had spoken a language more sensible than his voice. The tiny absurdity steadied him. He reached for his phone slowly. The screen showed 4% battery. Ruth had teased him for forgetting to charge it. He could almost hear her saying that 23 keys ought to come with one charging cord. He called the county wildlife response number. The recorded message lasted too long. He listened while watching the cat's sides rise and fall. At last, an operator answered and transferred him to Dr. Nora Bell, a licensed wildlife rehabilitator who worked with the County Ranger Service. Nora's voice was calm and direct. "Do not try to cut the mesh yourself," she said. "Do not offer your hand. Give her an escape route if the restraint loosens. She can't use one front leg properly. Can you see the leg? Not clearly. Is she alert?" Elias looked at the amber eyes fixed on him. "Very. That is good. Keep people away. Reduce noise. I'm 25 minutes out." 25 minutes seemed both brief and impossible. Elias called Principal Shaw, who had been leaving the grocery store. She trusted his judgment enough not to ask unnecessary questions. Within minutes, the evening basketball club was directed out through the front entrance, and the music teacher was asked to stop rehearsal early. The trumpet's 4 uncertain notes ceased mid-phrase. Silence settled over the rear grounds. Elias fetched 2 orange safety cones and placed them near the path. One toppled in the wind. He set it upright, and it toppled again. On the third attempt, he wedged a stone inside it. The bobcat watched this performance with narrowed eyes. "Yes," he told her. "I'm impressed too." He returned with a flashlight, a folded moving blanket, and his blue coffee mug, though he had no idea why he brought it. The empty mug still smelled of burnt coffee. He set it beside him like an old friend. The cold deepened as daylight drained from the trees. Moisture gathered on Elias's beard. Somewhere in the woods, a crow gave one final call before roosting. The bobcat shifted again. The mesh tightened. She snapped at it, then froze, breathing shallowly. "Easy," Elias said. The word felt foolish. Nothing about the moment was easy. He lowered the beam of the flashlight so it lit the ground rather than her face. In that softened glow, he noticed details that fear had hidden: the white fur beneath her chin, a small notch missing from the upper edge of her left ear, and one broken whisker on the right side of her muzzle. She was not large, perhaps a young adult, but her paws looked broad against the mud. A juniper twig was tangled across her back. The blue-green needles trembled each time she breathed. Elias remembered Ruth bringing branches of juniper into the flower shop during winter because she said green things reminded people that cold was not the same as death. The memory struck him so suddenly that he looked away. He had spent years keeping his grief meet. Yet behind a school shed, beside a wild animal that preferred his absence, grief and tenderness became the same ache. The bobcat made a low sound again, not softer, only weaker. Elias sat on the damp ground, ignoring the cold soaking through his work trousers. He placed his hands where she could see them and turned his face slightly aside, hoping the posture looked less threatening. He did not speak for several minutes. Then his keys slipped against the concrete with a faint metallic chime. The bobcat's ears rotated toward them. Her gaze moved from the keys to Elias and back again, as if storing the sound. Headlights finally swept through the trees beyond the service lane. A dark utility vehicle stopped near the cones, and a woman in a canvas jacket stepped out, carrying a transport crate and a long-handled capture net. Elias rose carefully. The bobcat pressed herself closer to the wall. Dr. Nora Bell approached only far enough to see into the gap. She studied the mesh, the injured shoulder, and the animal's strained breathing. "You did the right thing by waiting," she said quietly. Elias looked at the juniper branch trembling over the spotted coat. For the first time since finding her, he allowed himself to believe that waiting might be the beginning of helping. Dr. Nora Bell worked slowly. She asked Elias to remain where he was because the bobcat already recognized his shape, voice, and the faint music of his keys. Any sudden change might send her into another desperate struggle against the mesh. Nora set the transport crate on the pavement and covered 3 sides with a dark wool blanket. Then she knelt beside the shed, studied the angle of the tangled plastic, and prepared a sedative dart small enough for the young cat's size. "She may fight it for a minute," Nora said. "That part can be hard to watch." Elias kept his eyes on the bobcat. "I've watched harder things," he answered. He had meant hospital rooms, Ruth's empty chair, and the slow closing of the flower shop. Nora did not ask. The dart made a soft click. The bobcat spun as far as the mesh allowed and snapped at the place where it touched her flank. Her growl sharpened. She struck once at the blackberry canes, then pulled herself low against the ground. Elias's hands curled instinctively. He wanted to step forward. He wanted to say something useful. Instead, he remained still because stillness was the only help she could accept from him. "It's all right," Nora murmured. "Give her time." Rain began as a thin mist, barely visible in the flashlight beam. Droplets gathered on the cat's ear tufts. Her breathing slowed by degrees. The rigid line of her back softened. Finally, her head lowered onto one muddy paw. Nora waited another full minute before moving. She slipped into the narrow space with heavy gloves and long-handled cutters. Elias held the flashlight where she directed, careful not to let the beam cross the bobcat's eyes. Up close, the green mesh looked harmless. That troubled him most. It was the sort of thing people left behind because it appeared too light to matter. Yet it had wound twice around the hind leg and caught beneath the cat's body. Blackberry thorns had tangled into it, making every turn more painful and every escape less possible. Nora cut the plastic piece by piece. When the last loop fell away, the bobcat's leg remained curled close. Nora examined it, then touched the right shoulder with gentle, practiced pressure. "No break that I can feel," she said. "Likely a strain from twisting. She's thin, though, dehydrated, too." Elias exhaled. He had not realized he was holding his breath. Together they lifted the sleeping animal onto the moving blanket. Even unconscious, she looked built for distance and secrecy. Her paws were larger than Elias expected, her legs dense with muscle beneath the wet coat. The black tip of her short tail gave one faint twitch when Nora adjusted the fabric. "She doesn't like being fussed over," Elias said. Nora glanced at him. "Most bobcats don't." The reply warmed him in a strange way. It confirmed that the animal's resistance was not ingratitude or rejection. It was simply part of being what she was. They settled her inside the crate. Before Nora closed the door, Elias carefully removed the juniper twig from her back. Several blue-green needles remained caught in her fur. "Juniper," he said, without planning to. Nora secured the latch. "Is that what we're calling her?" Elias looked through the crate's metal grid. "Only until she tells us otherwise." For the first time that evening, Nora smiled. At the rehabilitation center, Juniper was placed inside a quiet indoor enclosure with low light, clean straw, and a wooden hide box. Elias was not permitted to enter. He stood behind a narrow observation window while Nora gave fluids, cleaned the mud from the cat's coat, and checked the strained shoulder. Juniper woke before midnight. She came awake all at once. One moment, she lay still. The next, she was crouched at the back of the enclosure, ears flattened and eyes wide. She struck the wooden wall with one forepaw when Nora passed too near. Then she retreated into the box and vanished completely, except for the gleam of one amber eye. "That's better than lying quietly," Nora said. "Anger takes energy." Elias nodded, though the sight of her fear stayed with him. He left shortly after, carrying the muddy blanket and his empty blue mug. Outside, the rain had become steady. He sat in his truck for several minutes before starting the engine. The passenger seat seemed too empty. At home, he washed the blanket in the coin-operated machine downstairs. A few juniper needles clung to the fabric even after the cycle ended. He gathered them from the drum and placed them in one of Ruth's small clay pots on the kitchen windowsill. The gesture felt foolish. Still, he left them there. For the next 3 mornings, Elias called Nora before opening the school. Juniper had eaten during the night, but refused food if anyone watched. She had climbed onto a low shelf using 3 legs and knocked over her water dish. She had dragged the bedding into the hide box, leaving the rest of the enclosure bare. "Strong opinions," Nora said. "That sounds familiar," Elias replied. On the 4th day, Nora asked whether he could bring something carrying the scents and sounds Juniper had already encountered. Elias considered his work jacket, then decided the smell of cleaning chemicals might be too strong. Instead, he brought an old broom handle and one of the retired brass keys from his ring. Nora hung the key outside the enclosure where it could move faintly when the ventilation fan stirred. Juniper remained hidden for nearly an hour. Elias sat in the observation room with his hands folded around the chipped mug. He did not call her name. He did not tap the glass. At last, a spotted face appeared in the hide box opening. Her ears tilted toward the key. It touched the wire with a delicate chime. Juniper stepped out. She still favored the shoulder, but less than before. She crossed the enclosure, sniffed the air beneath the hanging key, and stared through the observation window. Elias stayed motionless. Her gaze rested on him for several seconds. Then she sat with her back half turned, close enough to watch without fully facing him. Nora whispered, "That's not trust yet." "I know." But it was not refusal either. Over the following week, Elias visited at the same time each evening after school. He sat behind the glass while Juniper ate, paced, climbed, or ignored him. He wore the same green workshirt. He carried the same mug. Once, he accidentally sneezed, and Juniper leaped onto the shelf so quickly that he apologized for 10 full seconds. The next evening, she waited beside the shelf before he arrived. Fear had not left her. It had merely made room for recognition, and Elias understood that this was how trust began, not with touch, but with one frightened creature learning that another could be predictable. By the second week, Juniper had learned the difference between Elias arriving and everyone else. Nora's boots crossed the rehabilitation corridor with a quick, practical rhythm. The veterinary assistant wore soft-soled shoes that barely sounded at all. Elias came with the uneven step of a man protecting one knee, followed by the quiet scrape of his work jacket and the familiar chime of keys. Juniper heard him before she saw him. At first, that recognition did not bring her closer. It simply changed the way she hid. For strangers, she pressed herself deep inside the wooden box until not even an ear showed. For Elias, she remained near the opening, one amber eye visible through the shadows. He considered that progress. Nora considered it evidence. Neither of them called it affection. The indoor enclosure had a narrow service corridor running along one side. A row of high windows looked toward a stand of bare alder trees, but years of dust and hard water marks had dimmed the light. Elias noticed the glass during every visit. On a Thursday afternoon, he arrived carrying a bucket, a rubber squeegee, and the old broom handle Nora had previously left near Juniper's enclosure. "You're here to visit the cat," Nora said, looking at the supplies. "I can visit and clean. You know you don't work here. Dirty windows rarely check payroll." Nora gave him permission on the condition that he stop if Juniper showed distress. Elias filled the bucket with warm water and a small amount of unscented soap. Steam rose faintly into the cool corridor. He rolled up his sleeves, set the chipped blue mug on a shelf, and began with the window farthest from the enclosure. The first pass of the squeegee made a rubbery squeak. Juniper vanished. Only the tip of her short tail remained visible for half a second before disappearing into the hide box. Elias stopped. He waited until the corridor grew quiet again. Water dripped from the squeegee into the bucket. Outside, a light wind moved through the alder branches, tapping them against one another like dry fingers. After several minutes, Juniper's face returned to the opening. Elias did not look directly at her. He lowered the squeegee and switched to a cloth, moving it across the glass in slow circles. The sound was softer. Juniper stayed. He cleaned one pane, then another. Each time he shifted his ladder, he warned her with a low murmur before the metal feet touched the floor. She watched every movement. Her ears turned toward him, then toward the corridor door, then back again. A bobcat did not relax simply because nothing bad had happened once. She measured patterns. She remembered where danger had stood and how quickly it had moved. Elias understood that kind of caution. After Ruth's illness, he had begun noticing every unusual pause in a conversation, every late-night phone call, every envelope from the clinic. Even years later, the telephone ringing after dark tightened something beneath his ribs. Fear could outlive its reason. Perhaps trust did too. When the final window cleared, pale afternoon light entered the corridor and spread across the enclosure floor. Juniper blinked at the brightness. She stretched her neck toward the new patch of sun, sniffing as though Elias had opened an invisible door. A single drop of soapy water rolled down the inside of his glove. He shook his hand. The glove slipped free and landed beside the bucket. Juniper's eyes followed it. Elias picked it up before she could decide whether it was prey, threat, or insult. "Not today," he said. Her ear flicked. The movement looked so much like disapproval that Nora, watching from the doorway, pressed her lips together to hide a smile. Elias turned to the lower section of glass beside the enclosure. Dust had collected where the wall met the floor, too narrow for the mop. He fitted a clean cloth over the end of the old broom handle and began drawing it gently along the baseboard. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound traveled through the corridor. Juniper stiffened. Her body lowered, and the pale fur along her chin nearly touched the floor. Elias stopped immediately. She did not retreat. The broom handle rested 6 feet from the enclosure wire. Elias kept both hands visible and waited. Juniper stared at the cloth-covered end, her whiskers angled forward. Then she took one cautious step out of the hide box. Elias moved the broom again. Scrape. She flinched, but remained. He repeated the motion more slowly. The sound resembled the broom crossing tile at Cedar Hollow. The same sound she had heard faintly behind the maintenance shed before he found her. It was ordinary, steady, and connected to the man who had sat in the cold without reaching for her. Juniper came fully into the open. Her right shoulder still dipped slightly, though she no longer avoided using the leg. She crossed to the center platform and sat, wrapping her short tail close to one haunch. Elias continued cleaning. Scrape, pause, scrape. The rhythm settled between them. After a while, Juniper lowered herself onto the wooden platform. She did not turn her back. She kept her head raised and her eyes half open, ready to move if anything changed. But she stayed in sight. Nora stepped closer to Elias. "She has never rested outside the box while anyone was working in here," she whispered. Elias looked at the bobcat only from the corner of his eye. "Maybe she likes clean windows." Juniper yawned. Her mouth opened wide enough to reveal sharp teeth, then closed with surprising delicacy. One front paw slid over the edge of the platform. A moment later, she pulled it back as if embarrassed by the carelessness. Elias continued until the baseboard was clean. When he finished, he leaned the broom handle against the wall. It slipped, struck the floor with a hollow clatter, and sent Juniper upright. "Sorry," he said at once. She did not run to the box. Instead, she glared at the fallen handle, then at Elias. Her black-tipped tail tapped the platform once. Nora laughed softly. "You've been warned." Elias set the broom upright more securely. Fair. He sat in his usual chair and wrapped both hands around the chipped mug. The newly cleaned windows filled the corridor with the pale gold of late afternoon. Juniper remained on the platform. For 10 quiet minutes, neither of them moved much. Elias watched dust drifting in the sun. Juniper watched a sparrow hop between the alder branches outside. The distance between them had not changed, yet something within it had. She had heard a sound that once belonged to fear and allowed it to become part of safety. She had chosen the open platform over the dark box. She had rested while Elias worked. It was a tiny thing. Elias knew better than most that tiny things could hold an entire life together. By early March, Elias's visits had become part of Juniper's day. He arrived at the rehabilitation center each evening at 5:40, carrying the same things: his chipped blue mug, a folded newspaper he rarely opened, and a small paper bag containing whatever Nora had asked him to bring. Sometimes it held clean burlap strips for scent enrichment, sometimes pine cones, feathers found beneath the school cedar trees, or an empty cardboard tube with both ends safely opened. Elias never brought food. Nora had explained that feeding created the wrong kind of expectation, especially for an animal meant to return to the wild. Elias accepted the rule without argument. Care, he was learning, often meant giving up the gesture that would have made him feel most useful. Instead, he offered predictability. His keys announced him in the outer hallway. His left boot dragged slightly on the polished floor. Before entering the observation room, he gave one low, 2-note whistle, never loud enough to startle. Juniper began appearing before he reached the glass. At first, only her ears rose above the platform, then her face. Soon she waited near the climbing shelf, body angled toward the corridor, while pretending to study something else. Nora noticed. "She knows your schedule better than you do," she said. "That isn't difficult." Once, Elias arrived 7 minutes late because a first grader had stuffed 3 crayons and half a sandwich into a drinking fountain. Juniper paced from the shelf to the hide box and back again. When Elias finally appeared, she stared at him, then turned her back with such deliberate offense that Nora laughed aloud. I believe you owe her an explanation. Elias sat down and lifted the blue mug in apology. Plumbing emergency. Juniper refused to look at him for nearly a minute. Then one ear rotated in his direction. Her recovery progressed in quiet increments. The right shoulder strengthened. She climbed higher, landed more evenly, and began using the entire enclosure instead of favoring the protected corners. Nora added platforms at different heights and suspended pieces of bark so Juniper could practice balancing, stalking, and choosing routes through obstacles. Elias helped build the shelves after school. He measured every board twice, sanded the edges smooth, and tested the bolts. The fresh-cut cedar smelled warm and sharp inside the workshop. Fine sawdust settled into his beard until one of the veterinary assistants told him he looked like a frosted biscuit. That's seasonal, Elias said. Juniper inspected each new structure after dark. She distrusted the lower shelf for 2 days, then claimed it entirely. She ignored a carefully mounted scratching post and preferred the rough corner of the hide box. She also discovered that one hanging burlap strip could be pulled free if she worried it long enough with her teeth. The next morning, Nora found the strip arranged beneath the platform like a narrow rug. She has decorating opinions, Nora told Elias. Ruth would have respected that. The words left him before he considered them. For a moment, the room seemed to hold the scent of damp soil and flower stems from the old shop. Elias looked down at his mug. Talking about Ruth had once felt like opening a door into weather. Lately, it felt more like opening a curtain. Juniper moved along the platform and settled where the late sun touched her paws. Elias watched her and understood that healing had not removed her caution. It had simply returned choices to her. She could hide, climb, observe, or walk away. Strength was not making her gentler. It was making her more fully herself. That pleased him more than affection would have. Their evenings developed small rituals. Elias cleaned the outer corridor while Juniper followed his movements from above. Whenever he passed beneath the ventilation grate, it ruffled the white fur under her chin, and she blinked with visible annoyance. He began pausing there on purpose, pretending to check the mop handle, just to see the offended narrowing of her eyes. On Tuesdays, he brought school papers destined for recycling and read the children's drawings aloud without showing them to her. One picture featured a purple squirrel wearing snow boots. Another showed the principal as a giant, standing over a very small school. Juniper listened with her ears forward, though Elias suspected the crinkle of paper interested her more than the art criticism. On Fridays, Nora hid natural objects around the enclosure before Juniper entered. The Bobcat found them quickly. A grouse feather vanished within seconds. A pine cone received one dismissive tap and was never acknowledged again. A smooth branch became a favorite perch until Juniper pushed it from the platform at 2 a.m, apparently deciding the arrangement had become unacceptable. Elias repaired the mounting. She removed it again. After the third attempt, he surrendered. "Your enclosure," he said through the glass. Her tail tip twitched, as though she had always known that. The staff began joking that Juniper supervised his work. Elias did not mind. At school, children supervised him too, especially when he repaired anything involving ladders. Being watched by a bobcat was quieter and involved fewer questions about whether he had ever fallen through a ceiling. Still, boundaries remained clear. Elias never entered while Juniper was awake. He never pressed his fingers against the glass or tried to draw her closer. When she disappeared into the hide box, he allowed the visit to become one-sided. He sat, drank coffee, and let his presence ask nothing. Some evenings, that was all they shared. Those evenings mattered most. Elias had spent years believing companionship had to fill silence. Ruth had taught him otherwise, when speaking exhausted her, and he learned to sit beside the bed without trying to repair what could not be repaired. Juniper required the same humility. She did not need him to improve every moment. She needed him to remain harmless within it. One cold evening, sleet tapped the high windows, while Elias replaced a loose cabinet in corridor. Juniper rested on the upper shelf, her paws tucked beneath her chest. The old brass key hanging nearby moved faintly in the ventilation current. Chime. Pause. Chime. Elias whistled his 2 quiet notes. Juniper's eyes closed. Not fully, never carelessly, but enough. He tightened the final screw, sat in his chair, and listened to the sleet soften against the glass. For the first time since Ruth's death, the end of a day did not feel like something he had merely survived. It felt shared. Spring entered Cedar Hollow by degrees. Snow withdrew first from the south-facing slopes. Then the gutters stopped freezing at night. By the middle of March, the schoolyard smelled of wet bark, thawed soil, and rubber balls newly released from storage. Elias began waking before his alarm. For years, mornings had been something he endured by habit. He dressed in the dim kitchen, poured coffee into the chipped blue mug, and moved carefully around the silence of the apartment. But now he found himself listening for the first birds behind the old flower shop, wondering what Juniper had done during the night. He still opened Cedar Hollow Elementary at 6. He still checked the boiler, unlocked classroom doors, and rescued forgotten homework from beneath cafeteria tables. Yet on 3 mornings each week, he completed those tasks faster than usual and drove to the rehabilitation center before the first bell. Nora allowed the visits because Juniper was resting in an enclosed night shelter while staff cleaned and reset the outdoor habitat. Elias never entered a space she occupied. He worked only when she was safely separated by 2 locked barriers. Those rules mattered to him. The outdoor enclosure was larger than the indoor recovery room, with weathered logs, raised platforms, tall grass, and a shaded shelter built against the rear wall. Netting covered the top, though from inside it was easy to see passing clouds and branches moving beyond the boundary. Juniper had been transferred there once her shoulder became strong enough for longer climbs. The first morning, Elias saw her outside. She stood on the highest platform, with wind lifting the fur along her cheeks. She looked larger beneath the open sky, less like an injured animal, more like a creature temporarily tolerating walls. He had felt both proud and sad. A healed wild thing was always moving toward goodbye. Elias kept that thought to himself and carried a toolbox into the empty enclosure after Juniper had been secured in the shelter. He checked every bolt, tested each platform, and rubbed rough places smooth with sandpaper. The yellow work cloth hung from his back pocket. It was an ordinary square of cotton, faded from years of polishing door handles and wiping dust from baseboards. Ruth had bought a bundle of them from a hardware store because she disliked wasteful paper towels. Elias had been using the same color ever since. He left the enclosure after repairing a loose corner brace. Later that afternoon, Nora called him. "Are you missing something yellow?" Elias checked his back pocket. Empty. "I may be." Nora sent him a photograph. Juniper sat on the highest platform, with the cloth tucked beneath one forepaw. Her ears stood forward. Her expression suggested she had acquired the object through entirely lawful means. Elias studied the picture for a long time. "Evidence," Nora said when he arrived that evening. "Circumstantial." The cloth had somehow been pulled through a narrow gap near the service gate before Juniper was released from the shelter. She carried it to the platform, sniffed it, then pushed it into the hollow beneath a log. Nora removed it after Juniper returned indoors. The following morning, Elias brought a clean cloth. He kept it firmly in his pocket. Juniper watched from behind the shelter door while he inspected the lower climbing shelf. Only her face showed through the observation panel. When Elias bent near the gate, her amber eyes shifted toward the yellow corner sticking above his pocket. "You have enough decorations," he told her. Her whiskers angled forward. Elias stood and moved away. Later, after he had left and Juniper entered the enclosure, Nora discovered the second cloth beneath the same log. No one could explain how she had reached it. Elias laughed when he heard. It surprised him so much that he stopped in the middle of the school corridor and listened to the sound fade around him. He had laughed since Ruth's death, of course, at children's jokes, at the principal's stubborn copier, at his own mistakes when enough time had passed. But those laughs often felt borrowed, offered because a moment required them. This one came from somewhere unguarded. A fourth grader named Mina Cho happened to be walking past with a stack of library books. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you look different." Elias touched his beard. "Something stuck in it?" "No." Mina considered him. "You look like you remembered something good." Then she continued toward the library. The words remained with him all day. At the rehabilitation center, Elias began assembling enrichment bundles from natural materials approved by Nora. He tied dry grass around cedar bark, tucked feathers into hollow branches, and suspended safe bundles where Juniper had to stretch or climb to investigate them. He was not particularly artistic. One bundle leaned so badly that Nora called it a tired scarecrow. Another collapsed before Juniper entered the enclosure. Elias rebuilt it with stronger cord and claimed the first version had been a structural experiment. Juniper approached every new object as though it might be plotting against her. She circled from a distance. She sniffed the air. She lowered her body and advanced one silent paw at a time. Often she ignored Elias's work for hours, then dismantled it after sunset with astonishing efficiency. One morning, staff found cedar strips arranged in a neat pile near her sleeping shelter. Another day, she carried an entire grass bundle onto the highest platform and dropped it over the edge. It landed on Nora's empty wheelbarrow with a soft thump. "She's reviewing your craftsmanship," Nora said. "Strictly. Unfavorably. Standards are important." The warmth in those exchanges followed Elias back to school. He began humming while sweeping the first grade corridor. He repaired the squeaking library cart without being asked. He placed a pot of daffodils outside the office, using bulbs Ruth had once stored in the flower shop's basement. Principal Shaw noticed. "You've been arriving earlier," she said. "Work to do." "There is always work to do. You're smiling at it now." Elias lowered his eyes and tightened the handle on his mop bucket. He did not know how to explain Juniper without making the connection sound like ownership. She was not his. Her recovery did not exist to heal him. She had not entered his life, carrying a lesson chosen for his benefit. And yet, caring about her had changed the shape of his mornings. He had something to notice again. The angle of light through the alder trees, the return of robins, the difference between Juniper's watchful stillness and her relaxed stillness. The way she placed her hind paws exactly where her front paws had stepped while crossing a log. Small observations gathered inside him, filling spaces grief had left bare. One clear morning, Elias finished tightening the upper platform before sunrise. Juniper waited behind the shelter barrier, her body nearly invisible except for the pale fur beneath her chin. He placed a fresh yellow cloth on the service shelf outside the enclosure. "Not within reach. Not this one," he said. Juniper stared at it. Elias packed his tools and left. That evening the cloth was gone. Nora found it hidden beneath the log, folded over itself as neatly as something placed in a drawer. Elias held it up and shook his head. Juniper sat above him on the platform, separated by wire and distance, her short tail curled around one side. He did not mistake the theft for affection. It was curiosity, scent, habit, perhaps recognition. But when her eyes rested on him and one ear tipped toward the faint chime of his keys, Elias smiled the private smile of a man who had been given no promise and still found the gift enough. The first warning came on a warm night in late March. Elias arrived at the rehabilitation center shortly after sunset and found Juniper pacing the length of the outdoor enclosure. She moved from the shelter entrance to the highest platform, down the cedar log, along the rear wall, and back again. Her route never changed. Up, across, down, turn. The moon had risen above the alder trees, pale and nearly full. Its light silvered the wire overhead and laid thin shadows across Juniper's coat. Every few steps, she stopped and lifted her face toward the forest beyond the enclosure. She was listening to something Elias could not hear. Nora stood beside the observation window with her arms folded. "She started before dusk," she said. "She hasn't settled for more than a minute." Elias watched Juniper cross the log again. Her shoulder no longer dipped. She placed each paw with fluid confidence, stepped onto the platform, and stretched toward the moving branches outside. "Is she frightened?" "No." "Uncomfortable?" "Not in the way you mean." Nora nodded toward the untouched food near the shelter. Juniper usually carried it into cover before eating, but that evening she had barely inspected it. She had also ignored the cedar bundle Elias made the previous day, leaving it suspended exactly where he had tied it. That was almost more concerning. "She's restless," Nora said. "Spring is changing things." Outside, frogs had begun calling from the marsh below the ridge. Their uneven chorus rose through the damp air. A moth tapped repeatedly against the observation room window, making a tiny papery sound. Juniper froze, her ears pointed beyond the enclosure. The white fur beneath her chin lifted in the breeze. Then she gave a low, rasping call Elias had never heard from her before. The sound was not directed at him. It belonged to the night. Something answered far beyond the trees. Elias could not tell whether it was another bobcat or only the forest bending the sound into a reply. But Juniper heard meaning in it. She sprang onto the upper platform and stood there, staring toward the darkness. Nora's expression softened. She knows where she belongs. Elias lowered his eyes to the blue mug in his hands. He had known this day would come. Every repaired shelf, every stronger landing, and every evening Juniper spent outside had been carrying her toward it. Still, knowledge in the mind did little to prepare the heart. At the school, Elias had often repaired things so they could remain. A loose hinge stayed on its door. A broken desk returned to its classroom. A clock with new batteries went back onto the wall. Juniper's healing worked differently. The better she became, the less reason there was to keep her near him. She crossed the enclosure again, faster this time. At the service gate, she paused and sniffed the narrow space beneath it. Finding no opening, she turned with a sharp flick of her tail. "Impatient," Elias said. "Ready," Nora corrected gently. Juniper climbed onto the log and began rubbing one cheek against the rough bark, leaving her scent behind. Then she scratched the ground beside the shelter with quick backward strokes, scattering dry leaves into her water dish. One leaf floated in the bowl. Juniper stared at it as though someone else had caused the problem. She dipped one paw into the water, tried to catch the leaf, and pulled back in visible annoyance when her toes became wet. Elias smiled despite himself. That was avoidable. Juniper shook her paw several times, spraying droplets across the shelter wall. Nora glanced at Elias. She would disagree. The small humor passed quickly, but Elias was grateful for it. Sorrow felt less frightening when it could sit beside laughter without destroying it. He returned the following morning before school. Juniper had eaten during the night, yet the pacing continued. She climbed, listened, and watched the tree line. The old brass key near the corridor moved in the breeze, producing its familiar chime. For weeks, that sound had drawn her attention. Now only one ear turned. The forest held the rest of her. Elias cleaned the observation window, though it did not need cleaning. He wiped the glass once, then again, following the same square until Nora reached over and gently removed the cloth from his hand. "You'll polish a hole through it. Would save us opening a gate." Nora waited. Elias looked out at Juniper. "How soon?" "If she passes the final evaluation, perhaps 2 weeks." The words seemed too small for what they meant. Nora explained that Juniper would need to demonstrate strong climbing, clean movement over uneven ground, appropriate fear of unfamiliar people, and the ability to hunt live prey inside a restricted evaluation habitat. The release site would be chosen away from roads, houses, and the school. It would include water, cover, rocky ledges, and enough territory to support her without placing her directly inside another bobcat's core range. Elias listened carefully. "What happens if she doesn't pass?" "We give her more time. And if she does, we open the crate." He rubbed his thumb across the oldest key on his ring. Juniper leaped from the platform and vanished into the grass. For several seconds, the enclosure appeared empty. Then only her ear tips rose above the dry stems, moving silently toward the shelter. Wildness had returned so completely that Elias almost lost sight of her. That should have comforted him. Instead, he felt the old locked room inside his chest opening again. He had never become good at goodbye. When Ruth's illness worsened, he had avoided saying the word until time had said it for him. He had continued buying her favorite tea even after she could no longer drink it. After the funeral, unopened boxes remained in the cupboard for 3 years. Juniper would not allow that kind of pretending. Her body spoke plainly. That evening, Elias brought no enrichment bundle. He simply sat beside the window while moonlight gathered over the enclosure. Juniper paced for nearly an hour, then climbed to the highest point and faced the trees. Elias gave their familiar 2-note whistle. One ear turned back. She did not look at him. He felt the ache of that and the goodness of it at once. "All right," he whispered. "You don't have to." Juniper remained beneath the moon, every line of her body drawn toward the dark forest. For the first time, Elias understood that the kindest promise he could make was not that he would keep her safe. It was that, when the gate opened, he would not stand in her way. The release morning arrived beneath a sky the color of unpolished silver. Mist covered the low fields outside Cedar Hollow and gathered along the roadside ditches. The alder branches were wet, but still. Even the birds seemed reluctant to disturb the hour. Elias reached the rehabilitation center before sunrise. He had not slept much. The blue mug rested untouched in his truck's cup holder, filled with coffee that had gone cold by the time he turned onto the service road. His keys lay in the passenger seat instead of at his hip. He had removed them before leaving the apartment, because he did not want their familiar sound to confuse Juniper when the crate door opened. That small decision had hurt more than he expected. Without the keys, he felt unfinished. Nora was waiting near the transport building with Ranger Owen Hale, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, who spoke softly and checked every latch twice. The release site lay nearly 30 miles north, beyond an old logging road where pine forest rose into broken granite ledges. It had water, it had cover. It had no schoolyards, no houses, and no reason for a wild bobcat to hear a janitor's broom. Juniper had passed every evaluation. She moved cleanly over uneven ground. She climbed without hesitation. She avoided unfamiliar people. She hunted with the silent focus of an animal whose instincts had never needed to be taught, only given room to return. Nora had told Elias all of this the previous evening. He had said he was glad. He had meant it. Gladness did not prevent grief. Juniper waited inside the transport crate, hidden behind a dark cover. Elias could hear the occasional shift of her paws against the floor. Once, the crate trembled as she turned, then became still again. He stood 3 feet away. That distance had always belonged to her. "Ready?" Owen asked. Nora looked at Elias before answering. He nodded. The crate was secured in the rear of the utility vehicle. Elias rode in the passenger seat while Nora drove. Owen followed behind in the Ranger truck. The road left town and climbed through dripping forest. Spring had reached the lower valleys, but patches of old snow remained beneath the pines. Water ran across the gravel in narrow, shining threads. No one spoke much. At one bend, a wild turkey stepped into the road and refused to move. Nora stopped the vehicle. The bird crossed with slow importance, pausing midway to inspect them. Elias watched it disappear into brush. "Everyone has opinions about our schedule," Nora said. He smiled faintly. Juniper would respect that. From behind them came one dull thump against the crate. The sound silenced them again. The release site lay beyond a locked forestry gate. They continued on foot for the final quarter mile, carrying the covered crate between them along a narrow trail. Elias took the rear handle. The weight pulled at his shoulder and sent a dull ache through his left knee, but he did not ask to change places. Each step seemed to count down something he was not ready to name. The forest smelled of pine resin, wet stone, and cold earth. Water moved somewhere below the slope, hidden behind fern and fallen branches. A woodpecker hammered from a distant trunk. Juniper shifted whenever the crate tilted. "Easy," Elias murmured once. Her movement stopped. Nora glanced back, but said nothing. They reached a small clearing, bordered by granite outcrops. A creek ran along the lower edge, clear and fast from snowmelt. Above it, the land rose toward thick forest and ledges warmed by morning light. It was beautiful in a way that made Elias feel unnecessary. That, he knew, was the point. They placed the crate facing the trees. Owen checked the area once more, then retreated with Nora to a position behind a fallen log. Elias remained nearest the crate. He had been told not to kneel directly in front of her and not to stand along Juniper's likely escape path. He positioned himself several yards to the side, hands visible, body turned slightly away. The mist had begun lifting. A drop of water fell from a pine branch and landed on his collar. For a moment, no one moved. Then Nora released the safety catch with a long line. The crate door swung open. Darkness remained inside. Elias heard Juniper breathing. He did not whistle. He did not speak her name. The forest waited. A full minute passed. Then one spotted paw appeared at the threshold. Juniper's face emerged next, low and watchful. Her amber eyes scanned the creek, rocks, trees, and open ground. Her ears moved independently, gathering sounds Elias could not separate. She noticed Nora. She noticed Owen. Finally, she noticed Elias. Her gaze rested on him. He felt his thumb searching for the old key that was not at his side. Juniper remained within the crate for several seconds longer. The pale scar above her right shoulder showed faintly beneath her spring coat. Her broken whisker had grown, though the new one still looked shorter than the rest. She moved cautiously at first, body low, paws testing the wet ground. The moment her hind legs cleared the crate, she stopped and looked back toward its dark interior. Elias almost smiled. Even freedom required inspection. Juniper turned toward the trees. She crossed the clearing without sound. At the edge of the fern, she paused. Elias had imagined that pause before. He had told himself she might look back. Perhaps her ears would turn toward him. Perhaps the old brass key, had he brought it, might have produced one last familiar chime. But Juniper did not turn. Her attention belonged to the forest ahead. She took one step into the ferns, then another. Her spotted coat broke into fragments beneath shadow and new leaves. The black tip of her tail remained visible for one final second. Then it vanished. No branch snapped. No bird cried out. The forest simply accepted her. Elias stood beside the empty crate. The open door rested against the damp ground. A few strands of tawny fur clung to the bedding inside. Nothing else remained. Nora approached slowly. "She went well," she said. Elias nodded. His throat would not allow more. Owen lifted the crate and carried it toward the trail. Nora followed after giving Elias a moment alone. He stayed in the clearing. At last, he took the yellow work cloth from his pocket. He had brought it without thinking, or perhaps with too much thought. He unfolded it once, then folded it again. Leaving it there would have been wrong, so he returned it to his pocket. Love did not mean placing a piece of himself in Juniper's new territory. It meant allowing the woods to contain no obligation to remember him. Elias looked toward the place where she had disappeared. "Good girl," he whispered, though the words felt too domestic for what she had become. He tried again. "Go on." The trees gave no answer. When he finally followed the others down the trail, he did not look back. He was afraid that if he did, he might imagine movement where there was none. Behind him, the mist closed over the empty clearing, and Juniper was gone. The first week after Juniper's release, Elias listened for his keys more than he had before. Their sound followed him through Cedar Hollow Elementary, bright and ordinary against the morning quiet. They chimed when he bent to retrieve a pencil beneath a radiator. They tapped his belt while he pushed the supply cart. Once they struck the metal ladder and made him turn so quickly that he nearly dropped a box of light bulbs. For one foolish second, he had expected amber eyes. The halls filled with children, announcements, and the warm smell of cafeteria oatmeal. Life resumed without asking whether Elias was ready. A second grader lost a boot somewhere between the bus and the classroom. The music teacher's trumpet student finally mastered the fifth note. Someone drew a smiling sun on the dusty side of Elias's maintenance cart. He left the drawing there for 3 days. After work, he sometimes drove north. He never returned to the exact release clearing. Nora had been clear about that. Repeated human presence could disturb Juniper's adjustment and leave scent along the routes she needed to explore freely. Instead, Elias stopped at public pullouts miles away. He walked marked trails, stayed on the paths, and studied soft ground beside creeks without entering the deeper forest. He saw deer tracks, raccoon prints, and once the round impression of a black bear's paw. Every mark held his attention until its shape became clear. Bobcat tracks were compact and nearly circular, Nora had explained, with 4 toe pads and no claw marks in ordinary movement. Elias carried a small field guide in his jacket pocket. He read the same page so often that the binding began to separate. The first possible track appeared beside a muddy culvert. Elias crouched, ignoring the complaint in his knee. The print was softened by rain, but its width seemed right. Another impression lay farther ahead, then nothing. He photographed it without following. Nora examined the picture later. "Could be," she said. "Could also be a large house cat. There aren't houses nearby. House cats don't always respect maps." Elias accepted the uncertainty, though he kept the photograph. For several days, the blurred print gave him comfort. Then he began doubting it. The toes looked too narrow. The heel pad seemed wrong. He enlarged the image until it became nothing but brown pixels and shadow. Eventually, he stopped looking at it. Reports came through Nora's network. A driver saw a spotted cat cross a logging road at dusk. A forestry worker found remains from a rabbit beneath a ledge. A trail camera captured the hindquarters of an animal moving between pines. Each possibility reached Elias carefully. Nora never said it was Juniper unless she knew. Most of the time, she did not know. The trail camera image showed a short tail, but the left ear was turned away. Another sighting happened too far west. One set of tracks belonged to a male, larger and heavier than Juniper. Elias learned how hope could rise and fall without making a sound. At school, spring became summer. The children taped paper flowers to classroom doors. Field day ribbons appeared in the lost and found box. On the final afternoon before vacation, Mina Cho gave Elias a small drawing of a bobcat standing beneath a yellow moon. The animal had 6 legs. For running extra fast, Mina explained. Elias studied it solemnly. Useful design. She had also drawn a blue square beside the bobcat. That's your mug, she said, so she remembers. Elias thanked her and pinned the picture inside the boiler room, above the shelf where the real mug waited. He did not explain that remembering could not be demanded. During summer break, the school became quiet again. Elias stripped wax from floors, repainted the cafeteria trim, and repaired a row of lockers that stuck in humid weather. A family of wrens built a nest above the loading door. Elias marked the area with tape so no one disturbed it. Each morning, the parent bird scolded him as he passed. You picked the door, he reminded them. One bird followed him to the dumpster, still complaining. The small argument made the empty building easier to bear. He continued walking public trails on Sunday mornings. He never called Juniper's name. He never carried food. When he saw signs of wildlife, he observed and moved on. Once, beneath a granite ledge, he found tawny fur caught on rough bark. His heart struck hard. He stood several feet away and used his phone's camera to zoom in rather than touching it. The fur might have belonged to a deer. It might have been fox undercoat. Nora later said there was no reliable way to tell from the photograph. Elias deleted it that evening. By autumn, Juniper had been gone 6 months. No confirmed image had appeared. Elias stopped driving north as often. He told himself this was respect, not surrender. A healthy bobcat could move through dense territory without ever being seen. Avoiding people was evidence of successful rehabilitation. He knew all of that. Knowledge did not prevent him from glancing toward the wooded boundary whenever he crossed the schoolyard. Snow covered the maintenance shed and filled the narrow gap where Juniper had once been trapped. Elias cleared the blackberry canes, removed every scrap of garden mesh, and checked the area twice with a flashlight. He also began inspecting the school's storage practices more carefully. Twine went into sealed bins. Plastic netting was never left outdoors. Teachers learned to call him before discarding materials near the forest edge. When a first-grade class planted winter pansies, Elias replaced their loose mesh covering with a rigid frame. Because animals can get tangled? A child asked. Yes. Did one get tangled before? Elias tightened the final clip. One did. Did it get better? He looked toward the cedars, their branches weighted with snow. Yes, he said. She got well enough to leave. The child considered this. That's good and sad. Elias smiled faintly. Most true things are more than one thing. By the following spring, the juniper needles in Ruth's clay pot had turned brown. Elias had never watered them because they were only cuttings, not roots. Still, he could not throw them away. He moved the pot to the upper windowsill and placed Mina's 6-legged bobcat drawing beneath it. Months continued passing. Occasional reports arrived, none certain. Elias answered each call calmly. He thanked Nora. He returned to work. At 12 months, then 14, then 16, he no longer expected Juniper to appear. That acceptance did not feel like forgetting. It felt like carrying a closed letter whose words he already knew. She had survived long enough to choose the forest. She had walked away strong. Whatever life she lived beyond the roads belonged to her. On rainy afternoons, Elias sometimes paused beside the maintenance shed and heard water ticking from the gutters. His keys moved softly at his hip. He remembered one amber eye beneath the blackberry branches, a juniper twig trembling over a spotted back, and the tiny space between fear and trust. Then he continued his rounds. He had learned not to expect wild things to stay, but he had not yet learned that sometimes they returned. only after hope had become quiet enough to let them come freely. 16 months after Juniper disappeared into the northern forest, rain returned to Cedar Hollow. It began before sunrise and continued through the afternoon, light enough that the gutters whispered rather than roared. Red maple leaves pasted themselves to the sidewalks. The schoolyard darkened beneath the wet, and the cedar branches bowed as droplets gathered along their tips. Cedar Hollow Elementary held its annual Community Day despite the weather. Canvas awnings stretched beside the gym. Parents carried trays of muffins and paper cups of cider. Teachers moved raffle baskets indoors, then moved them outside again when the rain softened. Children raced between tables until Principal Lenora Shaw reminded them, for the fourth time, that wet pavement remained slippery even during special events. Elias worked from morning onward. He taped extension cords beneath rubber covers, checked the gym's side doors, and placed buckets beneath 2 leaks that appeared only when visitors were present. His faded green shirt darkened along the shoulders whenever he crossed the open yard. The chipped blue mug sat on the maintenance cart beneath the covered walkway. Mina Cho, now in 5th grade, had placed a paper umbrella over it. "Coffee shouldn't get rained on," she explained. "It has survived worse." "Your coffee probably is worse." Elias considered that. She ran back toward her class before he could ask where she had learned such disrespect. The exchange left him smiling as he lifted a box of extension cords from the gym storage room. Children's laughter moved beneath the awnings, mixing with rain tapping canvas. From inside the music room came 4 careful trumpet notes, followed by a 5th that cracked sharply. Elias paused. The student tried again. This time, all 5 notes survived. "Progress," Elias murmured. By 3 o'clock, the crowd had grown. Grandparents stood near the bake table. Younger children pressed wet handprints onto the gym windows. A local firefighter demonstrated how to test smoke alarms, while 3 boys became more interested in the reflective stripes on his coat. Elias carried the extension cords toward the covered walkway. His keys swung at his belt. The old brass key, the one that no longer opened any door, struck another with a clear metallic chime. He heard it without thinking. Then the schoolyard changed. It was not silence at first. It was the absence of one voice, then another. Conversation weakened near the fence. A mother stopped pouring cider. 2 teachers turned toward the wooded boundary beyond the soccer field. Elias followed their gaze. At first, he saw only rain. Wet grass stretched toward the cedars. Ferns moved beneath the dripping branches. A dark shape passed between 2 trunks and vanished. Someone whispered, "Deer." Elias knew it was not. A deer would have held higher. This shape had moved close to the ground, compact and fluid, its shoulders rising beneath a spotted coat. His heart tightened so quickly that he gripped the box harder. The shape appeared again. A bobcat stepped from the ferns. She stood 40 yards away, one forepaw lifted above the wet grass. Her coat looked darker beneath the rain, tawny brown broken by shadowy spots. Her body had filled out since the rehabilitation center. The narrowness of injury and hunger was gone. The notch remained in her left ear. Elias set the box down. The movement drew several frightened breaths from the crowd. Principal Shaw raised one hand, asking everyone to remain still. Teachers gathered children closer without rushing them. The firefighter moved slowly away from the open space between the animal and the trees. No one approached. That mattered. During the months after Juniper's release, Cedar Hollow had changed its habits. Signs along the woodland boundary reminded visitors not to feed or follow wildlife. Classes learned to observe from a distance. The maintenance shed had been cleared of loose netting, twine, and plastic. Now the schoolyard practiced what it had learned. Juniper watched them. Her ears moved separately, measuring each whisper and shifting foot. Her short tail remained low. The black tip flicked once when a paper plate blew from beneath an awning and skated across the pavement. A parent caught the plate against one shoe. Juniper's eyes followed it with deep suspicion. Even from a distance, Elias recognized that look. The world had offered her a moving white circle, and she had already decided it lacked good intentions. A small laugh trembled through the nearest group of children before fading into silence again. Juniper lowered her paw. She took one step into the yard. Elias felt every month between them. The muddy pullout, where he had mistaken a house cat print for hers. The trail camera photographs that showed only shadows. The tawny fur beneath the ledge. The empty reports. The brown juniper needles in Ruth's clay pot. He had worked hard to release expectation. Now hope returned without permission, sharp enough to hurt. Juniper advanced several yards, then stopped near the edge of the soccer field. The rain flattened the fur along her back. She lifted her nose and tested the air. There were too many smells: cider, wet wool, smoke from the firefighter's demonstration machine, floor cleaner drifting from the open gym. More than 100 human bodies, all trying not to move. Elias wondered whether she would retreat. She had every reason to. The forest waited behind her, dark and private. No fence blocked her path. No mesh held her leg. She was free. His hand moved unconsciously toward the keys. The old brass key touched the ring. Chime. Juniper's ears came forward. Elias froze. Her gaze shifted across the crowd, passed over the awnings, the tables, and the bright coats of children. Then it found him. The distance between them became terribly clear. Elias stood beside a box of cords in his soaked work shirt, older than when she had last seen him. His beard held more silver. Rain ran from his hair to his collar. His left knee had stiffened after hours on the wet pavement. Juniper stared. He did not whistle. He did not say her name. A wild animal's appearance could be coincidence. Recognition could be mistaken for curiosity. Elias refused to place his longing over what her body actually told him. So he waited. Juniper took another step, then another. Her paws entered the longer grass along the field. She did not move directly at first. She angled away from the crowd, keeping open space between herself and the awnings. Her head remained low, but her pace became steady. One child began to cry softly, not from fear, but from the strain of remaining still. Mina reached for the child's hand and held it without looking away from the bobcat. Elias's thumb rubbed the smooth edge of the old key. Chime. Juniper changed direction. The movement was slight, but it brought her onto a line toward him. She crossed the white boundary painted beside the soccer field. She paused near a puddle, looked down at the dark water, and stepped around it with careful irritation. Elias nearly laughed. 16 months in the forest had not improved her opinion of puddles. Juniper continued. The crowd stood behind him now. Elias felt their silence, their fear, and their growing recognition. Yet Juniper seemed to see only the man beside the covered walkway and the keys moving faintly at his hip. She came within 20 feet. Her amber eyes did not leave him. Elias lowered his shoulders. He opened his hands at his sides and turned slightly, giving her room to pass. The final distance belonged to her. Juniper stopped. Rain gathered on her whiskers. One drop hung from the shorter whisker on the right side of her muzzle before falling. Her ears turned toward his keys. Elias remained still. Then Juniper stepped forward again. Juniper closed the final distance without lowering her guard. Her paws touched the wet pavement one at a time. She paused beside Elias, angled her body, and pressed the pale scar above her right shoulder against the outside of his work trousers. The contact was almost weightless. It lasted no more than a few heartbeats. Yet Elias felt the entire history of that shoulder in the gesture, the strain caused by the tangled mesh, the first frightened flinch behind the maintenance shed, the slow return of strength on cedar platforms, and the spring morning when it had carried her into the forest. His hand trembled beside his thigh. He did not reach down. Juniper had chosen closeness, not capture. Elias understood the difference, and he honored it, even while every part of him longed to touch the rain-darkened fur. Behind him, someone drew a shaky breath. A teacher covered her mouth. Principal Shaw lowered her head. Mina held the younger child's hand more tight, though tears had begun gathering in her own eyes. No one applauded. The silence was too tender for noise. Juniper stepped away. She looked up at Elias, her amber gaze steady but unreadable. Rain clung to the small black tufts of her ears. The broken whisker on the right side had grown longer, though it still sat unevenly among the others. Elias smiled. "You remembered," he whispered. Juniper's ears turned toward his voice. Then she looked beyond him at the maintenance cart. The chipped blue mug sat beneath Mina's paper umbrella. Juniper stared at the ridiculous little shelter for several seconds, then shifted her attention to the yellow cloth hanging from Elias's back pocket. Her whiskers angled forward. Elias noticed. "No," he murmured. Juniper took one deliberate step toward the cloth. A few children made small, muffled sounds of laughter. Elias removed the cloth and held it close to his chest. "You have stolen enough of these." Juniper's tail tip tapped once against the pavement. Even Principal Shaw smiled through wet eyes. The brief exchange loosened the tension in the yard. It reminded everyone that the Bobcat before them was not a symbol or a miracle fashioned for their comfort. She remained Juniper, curious, suspicious, stubborn, and entirely capable of resenting a denied opportunity. A paper cup tipped near the cider table. Juniper startled and sprang sideways. The crowd stiffened. Elias lowered his gaze and remained still. Juniper crouched, ears flattened, body prepared to retreat. For several seconds, the forest seemed to pull at every line of her. No one moved toward her. The mother nearest the fallen cup slowly stepped back. The firefighter turned his body sideways. Mina whispered to the younger children to stay quiet. Her breathing eased. She rose from the crouch but returned to Elias's side. The distance opened again, natural and necessary. Elias felt no disappointment. In the past, he might have mistaken healing for the absence of fear. Juniper had taught him otherwise. Hewing meant fear no longer controlled every choice. It meant she could startle and still decide what happened next. She walked toward the grass. Before reaching it, she stopped beside the box of extension cords Elias had set down. One loose cable hung over the edge. Juniper sniffed the rubber, recoiled at the unfamiliar smell, and gave the box a wide berth. "Good judgment," Elias said. A boy near the raffle table whispered, "She doesn't like electrical work." "Neither does Mr. Mercer," Mina whispered back. Juniper crossed the painted boundary and entered the wet grass. Each step carried her farther from the awnings. She did not hurry, but her body lengthened into the smooth, silent movement of the forest animal she had become. At the cedar line, she paused. This time, she looked back, not only at Elias. Her gaze moved across the entire schoolyard, the children standing still, the adults keeping their distance, the maintenance sheds cleared of every dangerous scrap. She seemed to measure the place where fear had first found her, and where patience had later begun. Then she disappeared among the ferns. The crowd remained silent for several seconds after the last flick of her tail vanished. Only the rain continued. Elias bent to pick up the box of cords, but his knees weakened before his hands reached it. He rested one palm on the maintenance cart. Mina approached slowly. "Are you all right, Mr. Mercer?" "Yes," he said, though his voice broke around the word. Mina glanced at his trousers. A faint patch of wet fur and mud marked the place where Juniper's shoulder had touched him. "You should not wash those pants," she said. Elias breathed out something between a laugh and a sob. The laundry rules may disagree. She considered that problem seriously. "Cut out that part. I still need the leg. Then frame the whole pants." Principal Shaw arrived before the discussion became less practical. She placed one hand lightly on Elias's arm. "We should move everyone inside," she said. "Give her the grounds." Elias nodded. Teachers guided families toward the gym without excitement or crowding near the woods. Children spoke in whispers, as though leaving a church or a room where someone slept. Elias remained behind to gather the cords. He found the paper umbrella, still balanced over his mug. Rain had softened the paper until one side sagged. He lifted it carefully. Mina had written 2 words along the edge in purple pencil. "She came." Elias folded the umbrella and placed it inside his shirt pocket. That evening, after the event ended and the halls emptied, Elias made his usual final circuit. He checked the doors, gathered abandoned cups, and switched off the corridor lights 1 row at a time. The building settled around him. When he reached the maintenance shed, he stopped beneath the gutter. Water tapped against the metal roof. Wet cedar filled the air. No bobcat waited in the narrow space behind the wall. Elias had not expected one. He rested his hand over the place on his trousers where Juniper had leaned. The fabric had already cooled. The warmth was gone, but the meaning remained. For 16 months, he had carried the fear that he had imagined their connection because he needed it too badly. Juniper's return did not make her his, and it did not promise she would come again. It gave him something quieter. It told him that care offered without possession had not disappeared. Somewhere inside a wild animal's memory, his footsteps and keys had remained harmless. That knowledge reached places in Elias that grief had kept closed for years. He returned home, above the dark flower shop, and placed Mina's paper umbrella beside the clay pot of brown juniper needles. For the first time, the dried cuttings did not look like proof of loss. They looked like the beginning of a road that had led back, briefly, through the rain. For 3 weeks after Community Day, Juniper did not appear again. The rain stopped. The maples dropped their last red leaves, and mornings sharpened with frost. Cedar Hollow returned to routine, though the schoolyard no longer felt ordinary to Elias. Children searched the wooded boundary with hopeful eyes. Teachers reminded them that looking was allowed and following was not. Mina taped a notice beside the gym doors. "Wild animals need quiet more than questions." Principal Shaw left it there. Elias resumed his rounds without expecting another gift. He checked the maintenance shed, cleared leaves from the drains, and listened to his keys move at his hip. The muddy mark on his trousers disappeared in the wash despite Mina's objections, but the memory of Juniper's shoulder remained exact. One cold Tuesday morning, Nora called before sunrise. "I have something you should see," she said. Elias sat up in bed. "Is she hurt?" "No." The answer came quickly enough to loosen his chest. Nora explained that one county camera had captured Juniper near the protected woodland corridor behind Cedar Hollow. The camera sat more than half a mile from the school, where the forest thickened beside a rocky drainage. "She wasn't alone," Nora said. Elias stopped reaching for his socks. He drove to the rehabilitation center before work. Dawn had only begun to gray the sky, and frost silvered the roadside grass. The blue mud steamed in his truck, filling the cab with bitter coffee. Nora waited with a laptop open. The first image showed empty ferns beneath a timestamp of 4:17 a.m. The second showed Juniper entering from the left, head low, ears forward, her spotted coat pale under infrared light. The third image made Elias lean closer. Two smaller shapes followed her. The kittens were perhaps 4 or 5 months old, long-legged enough to move confidently, but still rounder through the face than their mother. One stayed close behind Juniper. The other had stopped to inspect a wet leaf, one paw lifted as though the leaf might explain itself. Elias smiled. "Trouble?" "Almost certainly," Nora replied. In the next frame, the curious kitten had pounced on the leaf. Juniper had turned back with the tired patience of a mother who had already reconsidered several life choices before dawn. The second kitten watched beneath a fern, ears slightly flattened. They were unmistakably wild. No collars, no names, no invitation to come closer. Only a mother moving through her territory with two young lives behind her. Elias studied Juniper. Her body looked strong. Her coat had thickened for winter. The pale shoulder scar remained visible, but she carried herself evenly. "She raised them this far," he whispered. "So far," Nora said gently. "They still have much to learn." The kittens would remain with Juniper through the season, while she taught them routes, cover, hunting, and danger. Their presence near the corridor did not mean they lived beside the school. It meant the connected woodland had become part of a larger path through her range. Elias understood the discovery was not a promise. Winter would test them. Roads, hunger, and territorial conflict remained real. But Juniper had lived long enough to become a mother. That truth filled him with a happiness too quiet for celebration. Nora had one more surprise. The camera team needed to replace a battery that afternoon. From a designated observation point across the drainage, there was a small chance Juniper and the kittens might pass near dusk. The visit would be controlled, brief, and distant. Elias agreed before Nora finished the rules. They reached the site beneath a sky heavy with early snow. Owen Hale joined them, carrying binoculars and a thermal scope. The three settled behind fallen timber nearly 100 yards from the drainage. No one spoke above a whisper. The forest smelled of cold stone, cedar, and damp leaves. Somewhere uphill, a squirrel scolded with relentless outrage. Elias shifted his boot, and the squirrel scolded harder. "Apparently we've been reported," Owen murmured. Nora hid a smile in her scarf. They waited until the light turned blue. For nearly an hour, nothing moved except chickadees and one confident rabbit. Elias's knee stiffened against the ground. He did not complain. Then Nora touched his sleeve. Across the drainage, Juniper stepped onto a flat rock. Even at that distance, Elias recognized the notch in her ear. She stood still, testing the wind. Behind her, a small bobcat slipped through the ferns and crouched beneath the ledge. The second emerged moments later, carrying a twig crosswise in its mouth. The twig caught between two stems. The kitten pulled backward, confused by resistance, then released it and stared at the abandoned treasure. Elias pressed his lips together to keep from laughing. Juniper looked back. The kitten hurried after her. They moved along the drainage in single file. Juniper chose the higher stones, and the kittens copied her paw placements with varying success. The cautious one followed precisely. The curious one stepped into shallow water, leaped out with all 4 feet, and shook each paw in turn. Elias remembered Juniper's indignation at the leaf in her water bowl. Some opinions, apparently, ran in families. Juniper stopped near the ferns. Her head turned toward the observers. The wind was wrong for scent, and the distance was great. Yet Elias lowered the binoculars and became still. No keys moved. No whistle sounded. Juniper watched the fallen timber for several seconds. Then she guided the kittens into thicker cover. The smaller shapes vanished first. Juniper remained visible for one final moment between cedar trunks. She had once come to Elias thin, trapped, and unable to trust an open hand. Now 2 young bobcats followed her because she knew where to lead them. Ruth's old words returned. Care did not become smaller because it had nowhere obvious to go. Perhaps it traveled. Perhaps one quiet act could pass through a wild life and continue into futures he would never own or fully see. Juniper disappeared. The observers remained until the forest settled again. On the walk back, Elias found a yellow leaf stuck to his boot. He removed it and placed it on a stone rather than carrying it home. This part of Juniper's life belonged where it had grown. Still, as he drove toward the school with frost gathering along the windshield, Elias smiled at the thought of one kitten dragging a useless twig through the ferns while its mother waited. Juniper had not returned alone. She had returned carrying proof that freedom had become a life. Winter settled gently over Cedar Hollow. The first lasting snow arrived during the night, covering the soccer field, the maintenance shed roof, and the narrow path beside the wooded boundary. By morning, every sound seemed softened. Bus tires hissed along the street. Children entered the school with red cheeks and wet mittens, carrying cold air into the hallways. Elias arrived before dawn, as always. He unlocked the side entrance, switched on the corridor lights, and listened to the building wake beneath the hum of its old heating system. His keys moved at his hip. The chipped blue mug waited beside the boiler room sink. Above it, Mina's six-legged Bobcat still stood beneath a yellow moon. The drawing had faded slightly, but Elias refused to move it. Outside, the wildlife corridor behind the school had become an official protected zone. Principal Shaw worked with Nora, Owen, and the county land office to improve the passage between the northern forest and the wooded ridge beyond Cedar Hollow. The project was modest. No grand monument announced it. Workers repaired a damaged section of fence, removed abandoned wire, and placed low wooden signs along the edge of the school grounds. Please give wildlife room. Watch quietly. Never feed or follow. Elias inspected the signs every morning. One leaned after a heavy snowfall, and he straightened it before the buses arrived. Another collected muddy handprints from children who could not resist touching fresh wood. Elias wiped it clean, though he left one tiny print near the corner because it looked like a child had signed a promise. The school changed in small ways. Outdoor bins received stronger lids. Garden netting was stored indoors. Teachers chose rigid frames instead of loose plastic around seedlings. During nature lessons, students practiced identifying tracks from photographs without leaving the marked trail. Mina helped organize a group called the Quiet Watchers. They met twice a month near the library windows and recorded birds, deer, rabbits, and other animals seen from school property. Membership required patience, a pencil, and the ability to whisper. The third requirement caused difficulty. On their first morning, a second grader shouted, "I see a squirrel," loudly enough to frighten every squirrel within half a mile. Mina closed her notebook. We are still developing. Elias, repairing a window latch nearby, turned away to hide his smile. The Quiet Watchers never tried to find Juniper. That rule mattered most. They learned that seeing her was not the measure of whether the corridor worked. Tracks could appear and vanish. A shadow might cross the camera after midnight. Some weeks offered no sign at all. Wildlife did not owe the school a performance. Elias repeated that sentence whenever hope made the children restless. Still, evidence occasionally arrived. One January morning, Nora sent a trail camera image of Juniper and the kittens moving through deep snow. The young bobcats had grown leaner and longer through the body. Their legs looked more certain, though the curious kitten still walked slightly apart from the others, head turned towards something outside the frame. In another image, that same kitten had climbed onto a fallen log, while Juniper and its sibling continued below. Independent, Nora said. Distracted, Elias replied. Both can be true. He printed one photograph for the wildlife board, but chose an image showing the animals at a distance, nearly concealed by trees. The children had to look closely to find all three. No names were given to the kittens. Mina suggested several, including Fern, Pebble, and Chairman Whiskers. The final option gained unexpected support among the younger students. Elias shook his head. They already know who they are. Mina considered this, then crossed out the list. By late winter, the cautious kitten began appearing alone on some cameras. Juniper's family was slowly separating, as young bobcats eventually had to do. Nora explained that independence would not happen in one dramatic moment. The kittens would explore, return, and gradually spend more time away from their mother. Elias understood that pattern. Letting go was often a series of smaller absences. The thought no longer frightened him as it once had. At home, the apartment above Mercer Flowers began changing too. Elias finally opened the curtains in the room where Ruth had stored ribbons, wrapping paper, and empty vases. Dust floated in the winter sunlight. For years, he had kept the door closed because every object seemed to be waiting for hands that would not return. He did not clear everything away. Instead, he cleaned the shelves and donated usable supplies to the school art room. He kept Ruth's pruning shears, her handwritten plant cards, and one roll of yellow ribbon that had faded along the edges. The empty clay pots returned to the kitchen windowsill. In early March, Elias filled them with soil. He planted thyme in one, small white violets in another, and juniper seeds in the third, though Nora warned him they might be difficult to grow. "Some things take patience," he said. Nora looked at him over the rim of her tea. "You may have practiced." Weeks passed without green appearing in the third pot. Elias watered it anyway. At school, spring rain replaced snow. The forest smelled of cedar bark, moss, and thawing soil. Frogs called from the drainage below the ridge. Robins pulled worms from the soccer field while pretending not to notice the children watching through classroom windows. One morning, Elias found bobcat tracks near the boundary sign. The prints crossed a patch of mud, continued beside the fence, and disappeared beneath the ferns. They were smaller than junipers. Elias placed 2 cones well away from the area so students would not disturb them. Then he called Nora. She examined the photographs and said the tracks could belong to one of the young bobcats, though certainty was impossible. Elias accepted that. He no longer needed every sign to become proof. The quiet watchers observed from the path. Mina measured the prints using a ruler without stepping closer. A younger child asked whether Juniper had taught the kitten to come to school. "No," Elias said. "She taught it how to move through the forest." "Then why is it here?" "Because the forest connects to more forest." The child looked toward the trees. "So the school is in the way?" Elias studied the buildings, pavement, fences, and narrow green passage beside them. "Sometimes," he said, "that is why we make room." For years, Elias had imagined care as fixing what was broken. Juniper had taught him another form, removing hazards, protecting distance, and allowing a path to remain open. By June, the third clay pot finally showed a green thread no taller than Elias's smallest key. He bent over it each morning, afraid his breath might disturb it. When Mina visited the apartment with Principal Shaw to collect leftover flower shop vases for the summer fair, Elias showed her the sprout. "Is that juniper?" she asked. "It's a plant." "I know. I mean, is it named juniper?" Elias considered the tiny green stem. "No," he said softly. "It gets to be itself." Mina nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Outside the window, evening light reached across the closed flower shop and touched the school's distant roof. Somewhere beyond it, hidden among cedar and fern, Juniper and her grown young continued lives that did not require Elias to witness them. That knowledge no longer felt empty. It felt settled. Years passed, though Cedar Hollow continued measuring time in familiar sounds. The first bell rang at 8:10. Lockers slammed between classes. Rain struck the gym roof in autumn, and winter boots squeaked across the corridor tiles. Elias Mercer still arrived before dawn, carrying the chipped blue mug and wearing the same ring of keys at his hip. He moved more slowly now. At 66, his left knee required a brace on cold mornings, and Principal Shaw had forbidden him from climbing the tallest ladder without help. Elias obeyed most days. On the others, Mina Cho, now a high school volunteer, appeared beneath the ladder with folded arms until he climbed down. "You have become very strict," he told her. "I learned from wildlife rules." "That explains nothing. It explains distance and poor decisions." Elias grumbled, but he stepped onto the floor. Mina had grown taller than Ruth's old flower shop counter. She still visited Cedar Hollow to help the quiet watchers, whose notebooks now filled an entire library shelf. Most entries concerned ordinary wonders: a fox crossing after snowfall, 3 owls calling before dawn, a deer standing beneath the basketball hoop as though waiting for a game. Juniper appeared rarely. One camera captured her crossing the northern ridge during Elias's 64th year. Her muzzle had begun to pale. The notch in her left ear remained sharp against the winter background, and her right shoulder still carried a faint line where the fur grew differently. Another image came 11 months later. She stood alone on a granite ledge at dusk, looking beyond the frame. The photograph contained no dramatic gesture, no evidence that she remembered the school or the janitor. Elias loved it for that reason. She looked complete without him. He printed the image and placed it beside Mina's 6-legged drawing in the boiler room. The 2 bobcats, one real, one impossible, watched over the old mug while Elias worked. The young bobcats, born after Juniper's release, established territories elsewhere. One was photographed several miles west near a protected creek. The other vanished from every camera, leaving only uncertain tracks and occasional reports. Elias hoped the absence meant skill. He had learned that not seeing could be its own kind of good news. The wildlife corridor widened when the county purchased a strip of unused land beside the ridge. Cedar Hollow students planted native shrubs along the boundary, supervised by Nora, Owen, and Elias. Elias carried watering cans instead of saplings. Principal Shaw had been very clear about his back. A first grader planted a cedar seedling upside down, roots pointing bravely toward the sky. Elias knelt beside her and helped turn it around. "Will it remember being upside down?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but it will remember which way the light is." The child seemed satisfied. By late afternoon, mud covered Elias's boots and the knees of his work trousers. He stood near the maintenance shed while children pressed soil around the final plants. The dangerous blackberry tangle was long gone. A permanent storage box held garden materials securely, and the narrow ground behind the shed had been left open. Rain began lightly. For a moment, Elias saw another evening layered over the present one. Amber eyes in darkness, green mesh caught him on thorns, and a juniper branch trembling with each shallow breath. He remembered how helpless he had felt. He also remembered sitting down. Sometimes the first act of rescue was refusing to make fear worse. The school held a small retirement gathering for Elias the following spring. He protested the word retirement and called it reduced interference. The staff filled the gym with paper flowers made by every grade. The cafeteria served cake decorated with a badly drawn broom and 23 icing keys. Only 18 of them opened anything. Elias appreciated the accuracy. Nora attended, her hair more silver than when she first walked behind the shed with a transport crate. Owen came wearing his ranger uniform. Mina gave Elias a wooden box made in her shop class. Inside, she had mounted the retired brass key, a small square of yellow cloth, and the softened paper umbrella from Community Day. Along the bottom, she had carved, "She came back free." Elias ran his thumb over the words. For several seconds he could not speak. Then he looked at the people gathered around him. Children he had watched become adults, teachers whose rooms he had kept warm, and friends who had learned beside him that love did not always ask to be held. His final official round occurred after sunset. Elias checked each door, though the new janitor had already done so. He straightened one crooked chair in the music room and retrieved a blue mitten from beneath a bench. The corridors smelled of wax, paper, and the faint sweetness of leftover cake. At the boiler room, he took Mina's old drawing from the wall. He left the chipped blue mug. Some things belonged to the place where they had done their work. Outside, evening rain had turned the schoolyard silver. Elias crossed toward the maintenance shed, keys sounding softly at his side. Near the woodland sign, he found a single round track in the mud. Age and rain had blurred it. It might have belonged to a bobcat. It might have belonged to a large house cat, wandering farther than maps advised. Elias did not photograph it. He stood beneath the cedar branches and let uncertainty remain whole. No spotted shape emerged from the ferns. No shoulder leaned against his leg. The forest offered only rain, wet bark, and the small movements of hidden lives. It was enough. Elias removed the heavy keyring from his belt. He held it once in his palm, feeling the worn teeth and familiar weight, then placed it inside his coat pocket. The yard became quieter without it. He looked toward the woods and gave the two-note whistle Juniper had once known. Nothing answered. Still, Elias smiled. The bond had never depended on another return. It had already endured in safer gardens, open corridors, young bobcats crossing distant creeks, and children who understood that kindness sometimes meant stepping back. He turned toward home as the evening bell faded behind him. On the apartment windowsill, the juniper plant had grown taller than the chipped clay pot, its green branches reaching toward the glass. Elias would water it in the morning. Tonight, he carried no proof. Long after Elias left Cedar Hollow Elementary, rain gathered on cedar branches behind the maintenance shed. It slipped from needle to needle, then fell into ferns where tracks softened and disappeared. Inside the school, the brass key rested in Mina's wooden box. The yellow cloth had faded almost white. The paper umbrella carried two purple words, though its edges had curled with age. She came. That was all the proof anyone needed. Not proof that Juniper had become tame, not proof that wild animals belonged beside human beings. It was proof of something quieter. Patience could be remembered, and kindness offered without a claim could remain inside a life that moved beyond sight. Somewhere beyond the ridge, beneath moonlight or early snow, a bobcat crossed a fallen log and vanished between trees. Whether it was Juniper, one of her young, or another wild traveler, no one would know. The corridor remained open for all of them. Above the flower shop, a juniper plant leaned toward morning light, while Elias slept in the next room, no longer listening for every absence. Now the schoolyard grew still. The final windows darkened. Rain softened against the gym roof. A blue mud waited beside the boiler room sink, and the woods breathed beyond the fence without needing to be watched. Thank you for staying with Elias and Juniper to the end. As you settle into quiet tonight, may you remember that love does not always need to hold on. Sometimes it clears the path, waits without calling, and feels grateful when a wild heart chooses, for one moment, to come near. Rest gently now. Let the keys fall silent. Let the rain fade into the cedars, and let the last image be Juniper beneath the trees, free, remembered, and disappearing once more into the dark. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.